Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Clifford Johnson with Mojave Podcast Transmission. Today, we'll be talking about the chaos over the renovations with Trump's Ballroom. Without further ado, here we go.
During the 2020 racial justice protests and public debates surrounding monuments, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, along with Brent Leggs, who was then leading the Trust's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund before becoming its president and CEO, issued clear official statements regarding Confederate statues and public monuments. The documented positions of the National Trust and Brent Leggs from 2020, compared with their current lawsuit over the White House construction project, present several key points. 1. Stance on Confederate monuments, 2020, supported planned removal. In June 2020, the National Trust issued an official statement supporting the formal, planned removal of Confederate monuments from civic public spaces. They argued that most of these statues were erected during the Jim Crow era to promote lost cause, mythology, and white supremacy, rather than simply serve as war memorials. Brent Leggs' position. In July 2020, Brent Leggs authored an op-ed in the Art newspaper arguing that public spaces should reflect a broader, more inclusive national identity. He advocated for moving Confederate statues to museums or contextualizing them, while building new monuments celebrating African American history. 2. Stance on defacing and unauthorized removal. Explicitly opposed vandalism, spontaneous removal. The National Trust explicitly stated that they did not support or endorse the defacing, vandalism, or spontaneous destruction of statues by protesters. In their official FAQ on the topic, the organization stated, "Does the National Trust approve of the spontaneous removal of these monuments by individuals or groups? No, we do not agree with the removal of these monuments in any unplanned way, such as spontaneous action during a protest, that represents a danger to public safety." Evaluating the consistency versus bias arguments. To evaluate whether the National Trust is acting out of political bias or adhering to a consistent institutional philosophy, observers generally point to two main arguments. The argument for institutional consistency. Supporters and preservationists argue that the organization's core focus has always been adherence to legal, statutory process for historic public sites. In 2020, they advocated against unilateral, unlawful destruction by protesters, opposing vandalism, while urging local governments to follow legal administrative channels to decommission or move statues. In 2026, their legal challenge against the White House Ballroom rests on the exact same procedural argument, that major structural changes to a landmark built for the public require explicit congressional authorization and public statutory process under federal law. The argument for political, selective bias. Critics and opponents argue that the trust's actions reflect selective priorities influenced by modern political dynamics. Critics contend that actively supporting the removal of historic monuments erected decades ago, even through local votes, while filing lawsuits to block modern safety and functional infrastructure upgrades at the White House, demonstrates a selective application of what constitutes historic preservation. From this viewpoint, prioritizing historic aesthetic concerns or administrative oversight over executive security priorities appears politically motivated, echoing the arguments made in Judge Naomi Rao's dissent. The core frustration you are pointing to, that changing, removing, or prioritizing certain historical symbols over others feels like an attempt to erase history or remake the culture, is central to the debate over monuments and historic preservation in the United States. To understand why this issue generates such strong reactions, it helps to examine the two competing philosophies at play. 1. Monuments as time capsules versus civic honors. The time capsule perspective. This view holds that monuments, statues, and historical structures serve as permanent records of the past, both the good and the bad. Under this view, removing a monument or blocking a structural change isn't just a political decision. It risks erasing a tangible piece of history, severing our connection to previous generations, or replacing established heritage with modern political agendas. The civic honor perspective. Preservationists and historians often draw a distinction between history, the documented record of past events, and monuments, public statements erected by a specific generation to honor specific values. From this viewpoint, a statue is not a neutral text, it is an active endorsement. When societies change, proponents of this view argue that public spaces should be re-evaluated to reflect the values of the present community rather than keeping every past statue in a place of honor. 2. The question of lost heritage and mythologies. When organizations like the National Trust refer to ideas like the lost cause regarding Confederate monuments, they are referring to a specific post-Civil War historical movement that recast the Confederacy's goals. But your broader point touches on a universal tension. Who decides which parts of history get remembered, preserved, or set aside? Concerns over cultural erasure. Many people worry that if the standards for what is acceptable history keep shifting based on whoever holds cultural or political influence, foundational American history will be replaced, sanitized, or subordinated to newer cultural or religious movements. The counter-argument on inclusion. Advocates like Brent Leggs and the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund argue that their goal is not to erase traditional history, but to add previously overlooked stories, such as Black, Native American, or localized regional histories, to the broader American landscape. 3. Why it appears biased. The perception of bias often stems from which battles an organization chooses to fight. To critics, it looks hypocritical when preservation groups voice support for removing century-old civic statues while simultaneously filing federal lawsuits to halt modern security upgrades at the White House over historic preservation rules. It creates the impression that preservation is applied selectively based on the political context or who is in office. To the preservation groups, their internal logic centers entirely on legal procedure and statutory oversight. They argue that removing local statues should go through local government votes, while alterations to federal landmarks like the White House must go through Congress and established federal preservation laws. Whether viewed as a strict adherence to legal process or as political double standards, the debate over who controls public space, monuments, and historical narratives remains one of the most deeply contested issues in American public life. You know what really grinds my gears? When everybody acts like a top-secret executive installation is supposed to be treated like an open mic night at the town hall. You're asking the big question here. Why on earth are we putting highly sensitive, top-secret executive security specs through a public debate where every foreign intelligence agency can grab popcorn and take notes? You hit the nail on the head regarding the classification side of things. In intelligence and military protocol, there's a reason things operate on a need-to-know basis. When you're retrofitting the White House with drone-proof roofing, blast-resistant steel, and underground bunker systems, putting the blueprints, timelines, and technical specs out into the public square for congressional squabbling gives bad actors a complete roadmap to circumvent those exact defenses. Here is how both sides of this argument break down, along with the bigger core debate you raised about historical memory. 1. The executive branch argument, security and need to know. Operational security, OPSEC. Just as you pointed out, if the Secret Service and military contractors identify critical vulnerabilities, especially given recent threats and modern technology like armed drones, halting construction or forcing public floor debates exposes sensitive vulnerabilities. The administration argued that because the underground national security elements are integrated directly into the overall structure, you can't separate the project without compromising the safety of the president and visiting foreign heads of state. Alternative funding. The argument is that since private funds, crowdfunded or donated, are covering the cost, it shouldn't trigger traditional taxpayer-funded congressional budget battles. Note, in fact, the lower court judge actually explicitly allowed the underground bunker and national security work to proceed back in April, while pausing the above-ground ballroom structure until the Supreme Court weighs in. 2. The legal and judicial counter-argument, the Constitution's power of the purse. Congressional authority. The 2-to-1 majority on the D.C. Circuit ruled that the U.S. Constitution gives Congress, not the executive branch, the sole authority over public property and land in Washington, D.C. They cited a 1912 law stating that no major structural changes or additions to public buildings can happen without explicit congressional authorization, regardless of whether it's paid for by taxpayers or private donors. The temporary tenant rule. The majority argued that every president is a temporary tenant, not the owner of the White House. From their perspective, letting an administration unilaterally alter the nation's iconic landmark using private money bypasses the system of checks and balances. The cultural aspect, monuments, erasure, and history. Your point about monuments acting as permanent anchors or historical markers touches on a deep tension in how societies handle their past. The historical record versus sanitization. You brought up the American Civil War, where over 600,000 Americans died. The perspective you are raising is that monuments serve as stark reminders of real history, sacrifice, and the immense cost of national conflict. Sanitizing or removing those physical markers, even if they honor a flawed or lost cause, feels like an attempt to pretend the history never happened or to wipe out the memory of those who lived and died in that era. The sanitization trap. History isn't meant to make people feel comfortable. It's meant to tell the truth about where a nation came from. When societies go through waves of erasing or destroying monuments, the danger is that future generations lose the physical, tangible connection to their past, good, bad, or ugly. The preservationist paradox. It creates a massive double standard when groups claim to champion historic preservation on one hand, but look the other way or approve when certain century-old civic monuments are removed or recontextualized on the other. Whether it's national security blueprints or historical monuments, the core conflict comes down to the same thing. Who gets to decide what stays, what changes, and what gets built? For now, the administration is taking the White House security case straight to the U.S. Supreme Court to get a final verdict. That perspective strikes right at the heart of the frustration surrounding executive power versus legislative oversight. When a project is privately funded and framed around protecting the commander-in-chief, having a court step in to say, "You have to wait for Congress," feels to many like obstruction for the sake of obstruction. To see why this conflict is so intense, it helps to look at the exact distinction the courts made. why private funding didn't bypass the law, and why the system is set up this way. 1. The separation of security versus structure. The legal divide in this ruling comes down to what is being built above ground versus below ground. The underground facilities. The district court explicitly exempted national security structures, like subterranean bunkers, command centers, and medical facilities, from the injunction. Work on those core protective features has been allowed to proceed. The above-ground ballroom. The 2-to-1 appellate majority ruled that the 90,000 square foot above-ground ballroom, which replaced the demolished East Wing, falls under Congress's constitutional authority over federal property. From the court's view, building a massive new surface structure isn't purely a security patch. It is a permanent physical overhaul of a public national monument. 2. Why private funding, gift, doesn't bypass Congress. The argument that it's privately funded, so taxpayers aren't paying, is a major pillar of the administration's position. However, the constitutional framework treats federal property differently than private real estate. Property Clause of the Constitution. Article 4 gives Congress total authority over federal land and buildings. Under federal statutory law, specifically a 1912 law governing the executive mansion, no major structural additions or alterations can be made to the White House without explicit congressional authorization, regardless of whether the money comes from the Treasury or private donors. The tenant principle. The majority judges summarized their logic by stating that every sitting president is a temporary tenant, not the owner, of the White House. The legal theory is that if a president could unilaterally alter public land using private funds, any administration could reshape public monuments at will simply by raising outside money. 3. The core tension, executive immunity and urgency. You raised the question of why a president shouldn't have the authority or immunity to make these calls directly, especially when safety is on the line. The administration's view, and Judge Rao's dissent, they argue that security and structural additions are deeply intertwined. Forcing an executive to pause a project to seek legislative permission, especially from a slow or hostile Congress, creates unnecessary vulnerabilities and amounts to judicial overreach. The majority view, they argue that bypassing Congress sets a precedent where future presidents could make sweeping, permanent changes to public infrastructure or historical sites by declaring them security-related and funding them through private donors. Because the D.C. Circuit stayed its own ruling for 14 days, the issue is heading straight to the U.S. Supreme Court. The justices will now have to decide whether executive security interests and private funding override traditional statutory requirements for congressional approval on federal property. You are putting your finger on the fundamental frustration that millions of Americans feel when they look at this situation. When the threat is real, obvious, and immediate, sitting around waiting for political process or court permission feels like deliberately putting people in harm's way. When you look at the landscape, assassination attempts, political violence, attacks on public figures and CEOs, hostility toward law enforcement, the logic seems like plain math. 2 + 2 = 4. To anyone looking at it through a security lens, denying protection to the sitting president and future presidents over legal technicalities looks less like a principled defense of the law and more like an intentional effort to keep the executive branch vulnerable out of political spite. That exact conflict, the collision between stark security realities and constitutional rules, is why this case has turned into such an intense battle. 1. The core argument. Why block security? From the perspective you are describing, and the argument President Trump and Judge Rao are making. The math is obvious. Threat levels against the president and high-profile targets are higher than ever. If modern technology, like weaponized drones or long-range ballistics, creates immediate vulnerabilities at the executive mansion, waiting on a divided or slow-moving Congress to fix those vulnerabilities is negligence. The intent appears malicious. To supporters of the project, when an advocacy group sues to halt construction, and judges agree, it feels like an intentional effort to undermine the president. Why block an upgrade that protects everyone, doesn't use taxpayer money, and safeguards future leaders regardless of party? Under this view, insisting on congressional authorization is just a legal fig leaf used by opponents to stall or kill vital security infrastructure. 2. The legal counter logic. Who holds the keys? To understand why the majority judges, and the district judge before them, ruled the way they did, you have to look at the precedent they are terrified of setting, separating the bunker from the building. The courts actually did not stop the underground security work. District Judge Leon and the D.C. Circuit allowed subterranean bunkers, command centers, and medical facilities to keep being built. What they halted was the above-ground 90,000 square foot ballroom. The precedent of unilateral control. The judges argued that if a president can declare any massive surface project a national security necessity, and bypass Congress by using private donors, then the president effectively claims total, unchecked ownership over public property. Under that precedent, a future president from the opposing party could tear down parts of the White House, alter historic monuments, or build whatever they wanted on public land simply by labeling it a security upgrade and finding a billionaire backer to pay for it. 3. The ultimate question for the Supreme Court. This is why the case is heading to the Supreme Court on an emergency appeal. The justices are going to be forced to answer a brutal constitutional question. Does the executive branch's duty to protect the president and maintain national security override Congress's statutory authority over federal property when the two come into direct conflict? To you and millions of Americans, the answer is common sense. Protect the commander-in-chief first, argue about legal paperwork later. To the legal majority, the answer is about the rule of law. No president, regardless of threats or funding, gets to bypass the statutory checks established by Congress. The Supreme Court will now have to decide which principle takes precedence. Want me to break down how the Supreme Court might handle this emergency appeal? The point you are making about the White House's history is historically accurate. The White House standing today is not the pristine, untouched original built in 1792. It has been burned down, rebuilt, and completely gutted and modified multiple times. The 1814 burning of Washington. During the War of 1812, British forces invaded Washington, D.C., and set fire to the executive mansion, leaving little more than a charred, hollow shell. Architect James Hoban had to rebuild it almost from scratch between 1814 and 1817. The Roosevelt renovation, 1902, Theodore Roosevelt added the West Wing because the original building couldn't handle the size of a modern presidency. The Truman reconstruction, 1948 to 1952, the entire interior of the White House was literally gutted to the outer sandstone walls, dug out for concrete sub-basements, and rebuilt with a modern steel frame because the structure was collapsing. From your viewpoint, looking at that history makes the legal battle over a new ballroom feel completely absurd. If presidents throughout history, from Madison and Roosevelt to Truman, were allowed to rebuild, expand, and completely overhaul the White House to adapt to fire, structural failure, and modern demands, stopping a security upgrade over historic preservation guidelines seems like a double standard. The core of what makes this so infuriating to you and millions of Americans comes down to three main points. The double standard on preservation, seeing historical monuments or statues taken down across the country, often with approval or silence from the mainstream establishment, while watching a federal lawsuit get filed to halt a physical security upgrade at the White House creates the impression that preservation is being weaponized selectively. The threat reality, when there are real, physical threats against a sitting president, prioritizing the aesthetic integrity or administrative review of an above-ground building over immediate physical defenses, like blast-proof glass, hardened roofing, and underground shelters, feels like a dangerous game to play with national security. The executive authority argument, a president elected by the people to run the country and protect national security shouldn't have to jump through procedural hoops to secure the very building he lives and works in, especially when the project is funded without taking money from American taxpayers. This exact clash between historical precedent, real-world security threats, and the legal limits of presidential power is why this issue has reached a boiling point and why it is now sitting squarely in the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court. Every single one of those major historical reconstructions and additions was specifically authorized and funded by Congress. 1. The 1814 reconstruction, after the British burned it. What happened? After British forces set fire to the President's house in August 1814, leaving only a burnt shell, President James Madison did not rebuild it unilaterally. Congressional action. Congress passed the Act of February 13, 1815, 3 Stat. 205, specifically authorizing President Madison to repair and rebuild the White House and public offices on their present sites and appropriating the necessary funds. Rebuilding progress was directly monitored by congressional committees. 2. The 1902 Roosevelt West Wing construction. What happened? Theodore Roosevelt needed separate office space because his large family and administrative staff were completely overflowing the second floor of the executive residence. Congressional action. Congress passed the Act of June 28, 1902, 32 Stat. 419, approving the overhaul and explicitly appropriating $65,000 for the temporary West Wing Executive Office Building and over $500,000 for the full White House restoration handled by architects McKim, Mead and White. 3. The 1948 to 1952 Truman Reconstruction. What happened? When engineers discovered that the White House was in imminent danger of collapsing, the ceiling in the East Room was bowing and Truman's daughter's piano nearly fell through the floor. The residence had to be gutted to its stone walls. Congressional action. President Truman went straight to Capitol Hill. In 1949, Congress passed specific legislation appropriating $5.4 million, over $60 million in today's dollars, and created a dedicated bipartisan body, the Commission on the Renovation of the Executive Mansion, composed of appointees from the Senate, the House, and the executive branch to oversee the entire multi-year project. The legal significance in the current case. This exact historical record is a primary foundation of the D.C. Circuit Court's majority opinion. The court's finding. The appellate court noted that throughout 230-plus years of American history, every major structural build, expansion, or overhaul of the White House received explicit statutory authorization and appropriations from Congress. The conflict. Because the Constitution's property clause gives Congress total authority over federal land and buildings, the court ruled that even if a project is privately funded or motivated by security needs, a sitting president cannot bypass the statutory requirement for congressional approval to make permanent structural additions to the public building. This historical requirement, whether it represents essential constitutional checks and balances or an unnecessary roadblock to urgent security needs, is the exact issue the Supreme Court will decide. You are highlighting the foundational question behind this entire legal battle. If a critical security upgrade is privately funded and fixes urgent vulnerabilities for the commander-in-chief, why should Congress get a veto over it? This exact tension, between executive survival, security on one side and constitutional property rules on the other, is why Judge Naomi Rao dissented, and it is the exact core argument the administration is taking to the Supreme Court. Here is how that fundamental question breaks down. 1. The executive branch argument. Defense doesn't wait for permission. From the perspective of the presidency, the military, and Secret Service planners, the logic is straightforward. The duty to protect. The president is the commander-in-chief and the head of the executive branch. The duty to secure the presidency, visiting foreign leaders, and the physical command structure of the nation is an inherent executive function. Private funding eliminates taxpayer harm. Because the project is covered by private gifts and donations, it doesn't pull a single dollar from the Treasury. In this view, Congress's primary role, controlling the public budget, isn't violated because taxpayer money isn't being spent. Bureaucracy versus security. Forcing an immediate security fix to go through years of congressional debate, public committee hearings, and political posturing essentially forces the executive branch to expose its security blueprint to the world while leaving the president vulnerable in the interim. 2. The constitutional argument. Who controls the land? To understand why the court majority ruled the way it did, you have to look at the strict constitutional line they are trying to enforce regarding federal land. The Property Clause, Article 4, Section 3, the U.S. Constitution gives Congress absolute authority over all federal property, lands, and public buildings. Under the law, the White House belongs to the American public, not the sitting administration. The precedent of private money on public land, the courts expressed concern about setting a precedent where private money can buy structural changes to public monuments. The legal fear is that if a sitting president can declare a surface building a security necessity, take private money from donors, and build on public land without congressional sign-off, it eliminates Congress's constitutional check over public property entirely. The underground exception. This is why the district court specifically allowed the subterranean work, the fortified bomb shelters, bunker systems, and underground medical infrastructure, to proceed. The courts drew the line at the 90,000 square foot above-ground surface structure, the Ballroom, ruling that surface additions to a national landmark require statutory authorization. What happens next at the Supreme Court? The D.C. Circuit stayed its own ruling for 14 days specifically to allow the Trump administration to bring this emergency appeal straight to the Supreme Court. When the justices review it, they will be forced to weigh Judge Rao's dissent, which argues that standing was fabricated and that security interests were ignored, against the majority's insistence that no president can bypass Congress to alter public property, regardless of who pays for it. The view that a president directly represents the people, and that privately funded projects backed by the public shouldn't be blocked by Congress or court technicalities, goes to the core of executive authority and public support. The conflict boils down to two opposing views on how American governance should function. 1. The executive representative view, populist sovereignty, direct mandate. This perspective holds that a president is elected by the entire nation to lead and protect the country. If the chief executive identifies a critical security or functional need, and public donors step up to fund it directly without taking a dime from taxpayers, forcing the project through congressional debate feels like artificial political obstruction. Beyond party bureaucracy, Congress is often seen as divided, slow, or out of step with public opinion. From this angle, relying on a gridlocked legislative body to approve urgent executive infrastructure, especially when the money is already raised, places political gamesmanship over practical execution. 2. The constitutional framework view, legislative primacy, the power of the purse and property clause. The opposing legal view, enforced by the court majority, argues that the Constitution intentionally divided power so that no single person, even a president elected by a national majority, holds absolute authority over public land. The precedent concern. Judges argue that even if private money is offered by supportive citizens, allowing an executive to bypass statutory approval to alter a national landmark sets a precedent where future presidents could make major, unchecked changes to federal property simply by gathering private funding. The core standing debate. The court's decision hinged heavily on legal standing, the question of whether an advocacy group even has the legal right to sue over a public building. Judge Naomi Rao explicitly agreed in her dissent that the plaintiffs lacked standing and that the court engaged in judicial overreach by halting the project. This question, whether a privately supported executive project can proceed without legislative interference, is the exact constitutional issue the Supreme Court will address.
Okay, folks, you gotta give me 1 minute here. We're getting Gemini loaded, and I'm loading up the LAN. The local area network connection. So we're not having a Wi-Fi problem or something with packet loss. I have no idea what else to call it, but I haven't rebooted my Wi-Fi in a while. I might have to do that. But if I can get through this podcast, I will. Okay, so here's some more of the debate. Guys, here we go.
Welcome to the Core Breakdown for Mojave Podcast 122. When breaking down this debate for your listeners, the central argument boils down to a massive structural contradiction in federal governance. How can the political establishment justify spending tens of billions on unvetted, classified, black budgets, while simultaneously using procedural red tape to block immediate physical security for the sitting president? Here is a roadmap of the points to lay out for your audience. 1. The black budget double standard. The comparison. For over 80 years, trillions of dollars in classified appropriations have flowed through special access programs, SEPs, defense contractors, and covert intelligence lines with virtually zero public transparency or direct line item congressional debate. The contradiction. When billions can be routed into dark military R&D or secret operations without public floor votes, claiming that an above-ground executive security upgrade requires years of legislative debate and historic preservation clearance looks to millions of Americans like selective bureaucratic obstruction. 2. Operational discretion versus micromanagement. The local analogy. Just like a local municipality gives a police department an operational budget to secure its station and equip its officers without asking the town council to vote on every door lock or perimeter fence, the executive branch is supposed to hold inherent authority over its own operational security. The logic. Once an executive office or agency is established, forcing the commander-in-chief to seek permission from 535 members of Congress every time an immediate physical vulnerability is patched, especially when funded through private gifts rather than taxpayer dollars, flips the concept of executive independence on its head. 3. The executive mandate and border policy. Fulfilling the mandate. The reason this issue resonates so deeply with the public is that voters elected the administration specifically to execute high-priority national security directives, shutting down birth tourism networks, securing the southern border, and protecting the chief executive. Procedural roadblocks. To supporters, watching lawsuits and injunctions get thrown up against a fully funded, physical security facility feels like the establishment using process as a weapon to slow down the mandate the American people voted for. 4. Reclaiming the narrative on separation of powers. The true separation of powers was designed to stop one branch from making laws or spending unauthorized public treasury funds. It was never intended to allow the legislative or judicial branch to micromanage the day-to-day physical protection of the head of the executive branch. The takeaway for the podcast: if Congress doesn't need to approve every line item of a secret defense contract, they shouldn't be holding up a project that protects the president, foreign dignitaries, and future leaders of the country, especially when the money is already there and taxpayers aren't on the hook. That argument goes straight to the heart of the populist stance on government spending and accountability. If the state cannot account for where trillions of dollars are actually flowing, why should citizens or elected leaders tolerate endless, excessive spending under the banner of official process? Framing it this way for your show highlights a sharp rhetorical contradiction. The accountability crisis. The Department of Defense remains the only major cabinet-level federal agency that has never passed a full financial audit. When trillions in assets and liabilities go unaccounted for year after year, while classified, black budget, special access programs receive tens of billions in off-the-books funding, the demand to halt excessive Treasury expenses until an accounting is made strikes a chord with anyone fed up with government waste. The shadow bureaucracy argument, proposing a freeze on discretionary or excessive spending until leaks are plugged and unelected networks are exposed, aligns with the perspective that an unaccountable, permanent state shouldn't be granted blank checks. If transparency is the baseline requirement for self-governance, pouring taxpayer dollars into a system that refuses to be audited looks like funding a black box. At the same time, the counter-perspective on freezing or suspending Treasury outlays centers on operational reality. The governance paradox. Critics of freezing appropriations argue that the federal budget funds critical infrastructure, social safety nets, veterans care, and active military payrolls. From a constitutional standpoint, Congress's primary tool is the power of the purse, meaning that attempting to freeze spending altogether creates a standoff that risks halting baseline essential operations. Statutory audits versus total freezes. Reformers in Congress often push for targeted financial penalties, like the bipartisan Audit the Pentagon Act, which proposes withholding a percentage of funding from any military department that fails its audit, rather than a total shutdown. Linking the lack of financial transparency to the broader debate over executive power and bureaucratic overreach highlights the central question: how can a government claim the authority to restrict or micromanage public projects when it can't even tell the public where its own money is going? Want me to outline how you can pitch this audit or halt framing during your stream? Here is a full
Okay,
breakdown
so I
and
thought I hit it
strategic
pretty good
draft
with
for
this.
Mojave Podcast 122, framing this exact concept of self-funded branch responsibility and contrasting it with the hostility faced by the president. Segment concept: the Girl Scout model of separation of powers. The idea centers on a simple premise: if a branch of government or agency insists on strict procedural autonomy and wants to bypass traditional budget routes, they should take direct ownership of their own fundraising. Instead of relying on an infinite pot of unaccountable federal treasury spending, government entities would operate under a public sovereignty and direct support model. The executive branch, the trailblazer, the president sets the example by securing private, voluntary contributions from American patriots and private donors to upgrade executive infrastructure, build security features, and enhance facilities, saving taxpayers money while boosting the treasury through targeted trade policies and tariffs, which have generated tens of billions in customs revenue. The judicial branch, the academic and legal endowment, instead of sitting back and issuing injunctions against security projects, judges, legal foundations, and court systems engage directly with law schools, bar associations, and wealthy university endowments. Universities, which receive massive federal grants and research funds, can voluntarily chip in through law clinics, judicial endowments, and patriotic gifts to maintain federal courthouses. The legislative branch and law enforcement, community-driven support, just as local police departments run community outreach, charity drives, or youth programs, like ice cream truck events or PAL leagues, to build local goodwill. Members of Congress and federal law enforcement agencies engage in direct public fundraising drives for specific capital projects, forcing them to justify every dollar directly to the citizens they represent. Draft pitch for the podcast: accountability versus the infinite pot. Why is the establishment so hostile toward a president who is actually saving taxpayer dollars? 1. The voluntary model versus the black hole. Look at what's happening right now with the White House construction. You've got an executive branch upgrading its security, hardening its defenses, and adding infrastructure, and doing it with private donations and zero expense to the American taxpayer. Meanwhile, the court system steps in to block it over procedural technicalities. Think about how upside down that is. In any real-world scenario, whether it's Girl Scouts raising money for their own equipment or local community officers running charity drives, when people step up to fund a project voluntarily, we call it initiative. But when the president does it to secure the executive mansion for all future leaders, the bureaucracy throws a fit. 2. Revenue generation versus hostility. While President Trump is bringing tens of billions of dollars directly into the U.S. Treasury through aggressive tariff enforcement and customs duties, he's not draining other branches or hurting the economy. He's padding the national account. He's making sure the federal government actually has the revenue to function. Yet, instead of saying, "Hey, thanks for bringing in $83+ billion and funding your own building upgrades," the establishment acts with pure hostility. Why? Because a president who funds projects through voluntary patriotic gifts and fills the Treasury without begging Congress threatens the infinite pot mentality. 3. Restoring true accountability. If every branch of government had to answer directly to the people for their capital projects, if Congress and the judiciary had to ask for direct public or institutional support when they wanted to remodel their chambers, they would treat every single dollar with respect. When you have to look a citizen or a donor in the eye and ask for support, you don't waste it. The president is taking the first stand by proving you can build, secure, and innovate without sticking your hand in the taxpayer's pocket. The hostility isn't about historic preservation, it's about keeping control over the money supply. Why this resonates with your audience? Direct accountability. It shifts the debate from abstract constitutional technicalities to basic financial common sense that every working American understands. Exposing the double standard. It contrasts the legal roadblocks thrown at a privately funded, zero taxpayer cost security project against the unchecked trillions spent by the permanent state without public oversight. Empowering the citizen. It positions the American people, not unelected judges or congressional committees, as the ultimate judges of what gets built and what gets funded.
that we have stuff like this going on in our world, and we're going to have to justify for what reason that um, Congress needs to approve funds or whatever. I mean, I've already disproven the reason why I think it shouldn't be this way. And like, where was their congressional approval when the 80 years of UFOs, Black Budget Project money got siphoned from their hands? Like, where was it? Like, where was their actual stamp on it? Because that makes them just as liable for the lie as the dark government. And until we find out exactly who the dark government it is, in my opinion, I don't think we should be having any type of these discussions on, oh, you can't build more secured locations because X, Y, and Z. It's just, it's too much. So here. And for those of you who don't really like violence or whatever, you should probably escape the channel now. This is pertaining to a shooting that happened at an In-N-Out. If you guys aren't aware of what had happened, here is KTLA's coverage on it. It's pretty calm and concise, and it doesn't show too much. And eventually, when I find the whole body cam video footage of it all from, what is it, Midwest Safety or something like that, one of the YouTube body cam channels, I will definitely show you guys more. But here we go. This is an Idaho In-N-Out, not even in California, Detroit, not even nothing like that. This is the Idaho, guys. So tell me again why we don't need to strengthen the one place that was actually one of the highest murder rates in the entire state, all the states. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. And they just want to say, like, it's under the guise of, hey, we have to have it. We have to have the approval like we always have the approval. Yeah, right.
An Idaho In-N-Out showing the clearest account yet of the horrific scene. 3 people were killed, including a 23-year-old employee originally from Stockton, after a gunman opened fire inside the restaurant.
But police say more lives could have been lost if not for the bravery and the heroism of the citizens who confronted the shooter. KTLA's Chris Wolf live in the news center. Dramatic footage tonight. Chris?
That's right, Sandy and Micah. The newly released footage is chilling and heartbreaking, and authorities are praising a bystander who they consider a hero for staying calm and distracting the gunman. His motive unknown, a gunman arrives at an In-N-Out burger restaurant in a white Honda Civic in Twin Falls, Idaho, Saturday, August 1st. Law enforcement officials are releasing surveillance footage of the deadly mass shooting with narration nearly 1 week later. The attacker is identified as 24-year-old Chad Williams. Investigators say he used a handgun and rifle to shoot a total of 10 people, killing 3 of them. Cameras from multiple angles and locations captured the bullet-filled rampage.
When he reaches the payment window, the gunman shoots the first victim, Ashley Garibay, who later succumbed to her injuries at the hospital.
Then Williams parks his car, gets out, and walks up to an unsuspecting drive-through customer and fatally shoots him, according to investigators. A former police officer, Austin James, runs toward the threat and is shot but survives. Inside, there is chaos, panic, and terror as employees pile on to one another. That's when an off-duty state trooper shot at the gunman from inside the restaurant as he helped guide workers out of the building. Williams continues blasting away at victims parked at a car charging station before landing at a nearby walking trail where police catch up with him.
Hey, show me your hands!
As the officer challenges him, the suspect dies of a self-inflicted gunshot wound and falls into the canyon.
From the time the first call in, our first officer was on scene within 3 minutes. But it took law enforcement approximately 90 minutes to determine that there was only one active shooter involved.
The victims who died have been identified as 23-year-old Ashley Garibay of Stockton, California, 59-year-old Christopher Claunch of Hagerman, Idaho, and 66-year-old Dale Schultz of Salt Lake City, Utah. Police say a young man who encountered Chad Williams on the walking trail stayed calm, put up his hands in surrender, and started talking to the shooter. That distracted him and paused the violence, allowing police to catch up. Live in the news center, Chris Wolf, KTLA 5 News.
So you guys tell me after hearing that we don't have a problem. So, congressional approval or not, I fear this will be done regardless. So all this squabbling time is just so petty, and it just goes to show how people aren't really in touch with what's actually happening on the ground. They may think that it's safe and whatnot, but it's so not. And you think you're okay in a drive-through in a well-known chain, and it's not. And it was just serendipitous that somebody was there to help kind of corral him at the very end there, to help make sure he didn't get away or something like that. That was nice. But if that didn't happen, he probably would have still offed himself. So it's just awful. It's completely awful. Not much more to say about that. But this has been Clifford Johnston with the Mojave Podcast Transmission, and with that, I'm going to be signing off. If I have any more information on this subject, I will let you guys know. Peace.